Chapter 2. The Unoriginal Non-Inhabitants. Yesterday upon the stair I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. Antagonish William Hughes Manns, 1899. The problem of Aboriginal history. It is difficult to recount the history of a people who did not legally exist until the High Court of Australia said they did in 1992. The court in the Mabo case shocked the nation with its findings that Australia had been occupied before British settlement and that the previously unknown inhabitants retained a legal interest in Australian land. Great Britain justified its claim of sovereignty over Australia on the grounds that it was uninhabited waste and desert. The doctrine of terra nullius, literally land belonging to no one, meant Britain didn't have to pay compensation or apologise to anyone for settling Australia because there was nobody there to pay compensation or apologise to. Apparently some black people had been hiding in our backyards for 60,000 years without ever having paid a day's rent, and now they wanted to move into our houses with their tubercular dogs, spear dugongs in our swimming pools, ritually circumcise young boys in our garden sheds, and generally lower the tone of the neighbourhood. These new Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were a challenge to every right-thinking Australian, whether Angle, Saxon or Celt. But most of all, they were a challenge to historians. Innocent schoolchildren now needed to be taught to feel ashamed for being Australian and to say sorry for things they hadn't done. Heroic tales of the Anzacs, Ned Kelly and Shane Warne had to be replaced with boring stories about bunya nuts. Professors of Australian history were forced to accept essays handed in on bark and to allow students to answer exam questions through the traditional mediums of painting lots of dots, banging two sticks together, or setting the examination hall on fire. Australia's inconsiderate unoriginal non-inhabitants had also neglected to invent writing before the white man generously gave it to them. This meant the Aborigines only had a prehistory rather than the proper history enjoyed by all civilised people. Aboriginal people claim they have an oral history, but this is just words. Europeans gave Aboriginal people history. One would have expected just a little gratitude in return. In 1993, the leader of the National Party of Australia, Tim Fischer, noted that the Aborigines had a stationary culture that hadn't even invented the wheeled cart. Neither had they got around to inventing the horse or cow to pull it. The Aborigines would no longer have been stationary had they invented the wheeled cart. Some argue that even if the Aborigines had invented the wheeled cart, they wouldn't have been able to train kangaroos to pull it. Rolf Harris conclusively proved that kangaroos are capable of pulling extremely heavy vehicles with his 1960 hit, 6 White Boomers. So it's good enough for Santa, but not good enough for Noel Pearson and his mates. It was up to the white man to give the horse and cow to the Aborigines, along with the other trappings of Western civilisation, like beads and mirrors, trousers, and the treatments for smallpox and syphilis. It was even up to the white man to give the Aborigines smallpox and syphilis. Did an Aborigine invent printing on the banks of the Rhine in 1440? Was Leonardo da Vinci a Pitchanjara? Did a Koori prevent World War III by inventing the atomic bomb? Let's face it, the Aborigines hadn't even thought of World War before white civilisation arrived in Australia. In 60,000 years, all the Aborigine managed to think up was a bit of bent wood that came back when he threw it. A smart man would have saved that time spent on research and development and simply trained a dingo to fetch it for him. The fundamental problem with Aborigines is that they are lazy. The so-called First Australians simply couldn't be bothered to build the pyramids, invade Poland or bowl Mike Gatting around his legs with their first ball in an Ashes campaign. A proper history is built upon such great deeds. A proper history also requires lots of dates for things to have happened on. If there is no record of when things are done, then there can be no measure of progress. History is all about progress, and Aborigines keep on getting in its way. So Aboriginal history reads something like this. About 58,000 BC, but we don't really know. Moved to Australia and failed to inhabit it. The lack of certainty as to when the Aborigines first came to Australia just doesn't cut the historical mustard. The Aborigines would have been far more interesting if we knew that they arrived in Australia just after lunch on 4 February 58,572 BC. about 58,000 BC to about 40,000 BC. Not much happened. 39,999 BC. Ate a big white grub that tasted a bit like chicken. This is historical licence, as the Aborigines had not yet invented the chicken. 39,999 BC to 1992 AD. Wandered without certain habitation or proper laws, and failed to exercise control of the land. About 12,000 BC. Did some finger painting on a cave wall, ate another grub. About 11,990 BC to about 2001 BC. Mostly sunny with occasional showers. About 2000 BC to 25 January 1788. Dingo introduced to Australia, unexplained increase in missing baby reports. 26 January 1788 to present day. White man introduced to Australia, explained increase in missing baby reports. In the absence of written records, the only way to understand Aborigines and their past is to dig up their bones and give them to international museums. This enables historians to draw important conclusions about Aboriginal people. For example, historians now know that the ancient Aborigines had bones. However, Aboriginal activists have stopped this practice and have even demanded the return of these invaluable specimens so that they can blow smoke all over them and bury them where they were dug up from. This defeats the purpose of digging them up in the first place. The average Aborigine supports historians and mining companies in their large-scale excavation of Aboriginal burial sites, as this furthers humanity's knowledge of primitive Aboriginal lifestyles and provides the mineral royalties that furnish Aboriginal people with world-class health, education and passive welfare. The problem lies with the radicals, the troublemakers, the ones who have taken the benefits of our Western education and, without so much as a hint of thanks, flung it back in our faces by stirring up an issue where none existed for us before. It is this lack of appreciation that hurts the most. Before white settlement, Aborigines were dying from toothache and skin infections. After white settlement, they were able to die from civilised diseases like measles and influenza. Before white settlement, Aborigines raised their children in primitive conditions. After white settlement, proper Christian families generously raised their children for them. Before white settlement, Aborigines lived in humpies deep in the outback. Now they can live in humpies in some of the best outskirts of Brewarrina and Alice Springs. In all of this, there is one word that best sums up the problem of Aboriginal history: Aboriginals. The Prehistory Wars. This is, of course, only one view of Aboriginal history. Before we consider alternative theories as to how Australia's unoriginal non-inhabitants didn't not come here and what they didn't not do after their failed non-arrival, we should talk a little about armbands. All Australian historians must wear either a black or white armband so that their views on Australian history and British settlers/invaders can be readily identified. Members of the black armband school believe that Australian history started about 60,000 years ago, that Aborigines have been left out of Australian history, and that the British invaders and their descendants have been giving Aborigines the rough end of the pineapple since 1788. They use words like genocide, stolen generations, and sorry. They can also be identified by their beards and or comfortable shoes and hybrid car bumper stickers that read "Kiss a non-smoker" or "It's your ABC." Many members of this school are professional academics and hand-wringers. Members of the White Armband School believe that Australian history started with Captain Cook in 1770 and that Aboriginal people, if they in fact exist, stumbled across Australia by accident, that nothing bad has happened to them since, but if it did, which it probably didn't, that was also an accident. They use words like natural attrition, vulnerable children in need of care and protection, and wind shuttle. They can be identified by their rose-coloured glasses or their white-coloured canes and golden-coloured retrievers. Many members of this school work in talkback radio or conservative think tanks. Australia's first boat people. There is uncertainty as to when the first boat people bobbed their way to Australia, but most historians suggest that people started calling Australia home around 60,000 BP, before Peter Allen. The oldest human remains found in Australia belong to Mungo Man and his much younger girlfriend, by about 14,000 years, Mungo Lady, both of whom lived near Lake Mungo in southwest New South Wales. Mungo Man died about 40,000 years ago. His body was sprinkled with red ochre, the world's oldest example of ritual burial. Mungo Lady died about 26,000 years ago, and her body was burned, smashed to bits, then burned again. The world's oldest example of being burned, smashed to bits, then burned again. Australia was a very different place 60,000 years ago. It was so different that it wasn't even Australia, but a place called Sahul. Sahulians could walk from the Australian mainland to Tasmania or New Guinea without getting their feet wet, because Australia was not nearly as girt as it is now. Sea levels were at least 70 metres lower, and it would have been possible to paddle a bit of bamboo from the Asian mainland to Sahul without ever losing sight of land. Most experts believe that Sahul was settled by a single group from whom all Aboriginal people are descended. Critics of this single wave theory point out that there was enough bamboo in Southeast Asia to build more than one raft, and if one group was able to make it to Australia, why couldn't 2 or 3 or 46? Some Aborigines discount both the single wave and multi-wave theories, believing instead that they were created in Australia through the forging of the elements with ancestral spirits. Single wave, multi-wave or no wave. This is one of the bloodiest battles of the prehistory wars. Nobody's bitch. Both single and multi-wavers acknowledge that getting to Australia wasn't easy. The proto-Aborigines had to walk all the way from Africa, putting up with tens of thousands of years of their children whining, "Are we there yet?" before they could start paddling their bamboo rafts. Those on the long march through Asia would have clung to the coast, as the surrounding jungle was full of giant cats desperate to sample the new human-flavoured whiskers. Man had lived his short life red in tooth and claw. Eating and avoiding being eaten took up all of his energy, and he simply had no time to compose a sonata for 6 sticks and hollow log, develop the iStone 2.0, or ask himself complex questions like, "Why am I here?" This was actually a very easy question for early man to answer. I am here because the 10-foot striped cat is not. Man finally discovered leisure while holidaying in Bali. One morning he woke up and saw some smoke from across the channel that separates Bali from the island of Lombok. Bali was getting a bit touristy, he thought. There were just too many people and tigers. So he unpacked his bamboo raft, which had been put away for a couple of millennia, and floated the 35 kilometres to Lombok. He had just crossed the Wallace Line, a deep ocean trench that forms a natural barrier between the ferocious beasts of mainland Asia and the soft and cuddly animals of Sahul. Over in Lombok, there was a 24-hour buffet of cute new animals demanding to be eaten. History shows what happens when man comes into contact with animals that have never met him before. The dodo of Mauritius was known for its inquisitive personality and its habit of sitting there while being clubbed to death by passing sailors. The word dodo probably comes from the Dutch doda's, meaning fat ass or not ass, a name gifted by Captain Willem van Wessanen in 1602. Other scholars suggest the name comes from the Dutch dodors, meaning sluggard, or the Old Portuguese dudo, meaning fool. The Dutch also referred to the dodo as wolfvogel, or loathsome bird. The dodo clearly had a major PR problem. The moa provides another example of what happens when man first encourages a new animal. The moa was a delicious 12-foot tall bird. The Maori thought it finger-licking good and ate every single member of its 11 species within a couple of centuries of settling New Zealand. The miniature wombats of King Island moved into the big, warm burrows of the sealers, who would let them trundle about their huts until they felt like another helping of wombat stew. Arthur Bowes, a First Fleet surgeon and one of the first men to encounter and eat Norfolk Island's enchanting bird life, summed up how man deals with animals that have not learnt to fear him. "We had nothing more to do than stand still a minute or two and knock down as many as we pleased with a short stick. If you throwed at them and missed them, or even hit them without killing them, they never made the least attempt to fly away, and indeed they would only run a few yards from you and be as quiet and unconcerned as if nothing had happened." In Lombok, man could eat his way through an entire island without running into anything bigger and nastier than himself. For the first time in history, man was nobody's bitch. This meant he could spend his new spare time working out how to stop his bamboo raft from sinking every few hours, telling campfire tales, and painting pictures of all the animals he had just eaten. But just as culture was beginning to simmer in the saucepan of prehistory, the animals that were left wised up and the food ran out. Who killed Skippy's mum? Man was hungry and hoped that the island on the horizon had not run out of obliging animals, so he pulled out his new improved bamboo raft and started paddling again. This pattern repeated itself until man ran into a really big island that would take a long time to eat out. That island was Australia. The first Australians immediately noticed two things. First, there was no bamboo, so they wouldn't be returning to Asia to visit their Stone Age in-laws. Second, the biggest stupid animal they had ever seen was sitting on the beach, thoughtfully stuffing nuts into its pouch, so that the Aborigines might celebrate their first Australia Day with a supersized serving of Diprotodon a la Bunya. The Diprotodon was a marsupial. Marsupials didn't have to be smart because there were no really big warm-blooded predators in Australia. Australia also had the world's poorest soil, which produced plants low in nutrition and high in toxic chemicals. The low energy intake and high energy cost of breaking down poisonous plants meant marsupials had to conserve energy by shutting down their brains. Take the koala. The energy cost of breaking down eucalyptus oil means the koala can't do anything more strenuous than eat, sleep and piddle on Japanese tourists. The koala's evolution towards a smaller brain has been so rapid that its shriveled cerebellum is too small for its skull, meaning it suffers concussion every time it turns its head. This is not actually a problem for the koala, as it is too stoned on gum leaves to notice. Entire koala populations are now dying from chlamydia because koalas are too stupid to wear condoms. The skull of the Diprotodon, the rhinoceros-like marsupial encountered by the first Australians, was filled with a tiny brain and enormous sinus cavities. The Aborigines would have been able to hunt down this gentle giant, armed only with a pointed stick and a very large handkerchief. The Diprotodon was not the only example of Australian megafauna, Latin for really big animal. Prosoptodon galea was a 10-foot tall kangaroo with a face like a gorilla. Phascolonus gigas was the original 200-kilogram wombat from hell, and Giornis newtoni was an ostrich-sized duck. Giornis was a relative of Australia's extinct Bullocornis plani, affectionately known by paleontologists as the demon duck of doom, on account of it being a quarter-ton, 8-foot-tall, kick-ass carnivorous duck. Professor Tim Flannery, one of Australia's best-known know-it-alls, supports the blitzkrieg theory of megafaunal extinction, the central tenet of which is the Aborigines did it. Flannery, who wears a giant extinct kangaroo armband, argues that the Aborigines rapidly spread across the continent, snacking on the biggest animals they could find as they went. The removal of all the giant herbivores about 47,000 years ago led to the rapid growth of thick underbrush in which the increasingly nervous smaller animals were able to hide. The Aborigines solved this problem by torching the whole continent, destroying most of Australia's rainforest in the process. Many Aboriginal people regard themselves as custodians of the land, who have always lived in balance with nature. They get a little tetchy when accused of megafaunal genocide and continental arson. Stephen Hagan, an Aboriginal activist and academic, says, "I would argue that Tim Flannery probably as a young kid had a very vivid imagination. He probably read a lot of fanciful British books as a young boy, and he's grown up to be a little creative himself. There's no evidence of Aboriginal people living unsustainably. We live with our animals and the megafauna. I can't see if the megafauna were as big as they say they were, the size of 2 elephants. It's going to take a lot of time for a tribe of 30 people to eat 1 elephant in a month, let alone, as Tim Flannery said, eat them all out. I mean, they would have had to bring in all 250 tribes, which was 1 million Aborigines in Australia before the white man came. They would have had to bring all of them down to one tribal area to eat out all the animals. I mean, how ridiculous is Tim Flannery?" Hagan and others who reject Flannery's death by luncheon argument blame the weather. They say there is no way people can munch through a whole continent before the animals get suspicious, and that fossil records show the Aborigines and the megafauna frolicked happily together for at least 10,000 years, until increased aridity resulting from the last 2 ice ages caused the great megafaunal checkout. There's no time like dream time. Australian farmers whinge in cycles. When they're not moaning about insufficient drought assistance, they're demanding subsidised scuba gear for their cattle. This is because Australia doesn't have regular seasons like other continents. Instead, it has El Nino and La Nina, which are Spanish for shitty weather. The droughts and flooding rains caused by these loco weather systems meant that the Aborigines enjoyed years of plenty, interrupted by periods of wondering where all the food had gone. The times of scarcity kept populations low and required the Aborigines to forage widely for food. Living off the land was far easier than living on it, a fact that was lost on the British, who insisted that land could not be inhabited unless it was covered with castles, ornamental gardens and statues of inbred monarchs. Nomads are not into possessions. It's hard to chase a kangaroo when you've got an ironback dining suite with deluxe wombat leather trimmings strapped to your back. So the Aborigines travelled light and invented tools that were specialised in design but generalised in application. A spear thrower might also be used as a water carrier, fire stick, chisel, shield or musical instrument. The Aborigines conceived the Swiss Army knife when the Swiss were still hiding in holes in the ground and smearing themselves with rancid bison fat. While life was tough during the harsh times, food was abundant during the good years, so the Aborigines could spend a small part of their day doing boring hunting-gathering stuff and the rest of their time developing a complex and vibrant culture. Communities flourished and traded with each other, with shells from Cape York found as far afield as the West Australian coast. Over 200 languages were whispered among the ghost gums. Music was played under the stars, and the living rock and trees willingly gave up their flesh to the stain of hauntingly beautiful works of art. Animals were hunted, fish were fished, and the rubbish was taken out to the midden every bin night. There was time for work, time for play, time for love, and time for each other. Sure, there was also time for spearing people who looked at you a bit funny, but nobody's perfect. The dingo arrived in Australia about 4,000 years ago, probably carried in the canoes of the Lapita, the ancestors of today's Polynesian people. The dingo was a tasty snack for long sea voyages. It was literally dinner to go, and the Lapita were the world's first fast food delivery service. The Lapita were also the world's first great seafaring race. The Lapita or their descendants may well have discovered the east coast of Australia when Captain Cook was nothing more than a gleam in the eye of his many greats-grandmother. The Maori had legends of Ulamaroa, a vast land lying 1 month's hard paddling to New Zealand's northwest. The Lapita carried their dingoes to Asia after their Australian stopover, as shown by kangaroo lice on Asian dogs. Dingoes roam the forests and plains of northern Thailand to this day. The dingo revolutionised Aboriginal society. It was hunting companion, pest exterminator and hot water bottle rolled into one. Through the lives of the hundreds of Aboriginal tribes that peopled Australia, with their different languages and customs, ran the common thread of the dream time, a complex code for how life is to be lived, how food is to be gathered, and how marriage, trade and disputes are to be regulated. It recognises that people are part of the land they inhabit, and the land is part of the people. The dream time fuses past, present and future with the physical and spiritual worlds, leading Australia's greatest anthropologist, W.E.H. Stanner, to sum it up beautifully as every when. James Bonwick, a 19th century historian, said of the Aborigines, "They knew no past, they wanted no future. Unfortunately for them, they got one on 26 January 1788. Intermission. Well, that's the Aborigines and foreigners out of the way. Thank God for that. Now we can get back to some real Australian history. Jolly convicts, villainous governors, rum, squatting with sheep, rum, gold diggers and other token women, geographically and nutritionally challenged explorers, rum, plucky Irish outlaws in scrap metal couture, stump jump ploughs and coolgardie safes, stocked with rum. But you've got time for a quick smoko before the good stuff starts. So light up a Winnie Blue, put a bushels in the microwave and throw another Anzac biscuit on the Lazy Susan. Ready? Then let's return to Captain Cook.